How does a simple gas station visit turn into a violent arrest? Malcolm Hayes handed over a perfectly real $20 bill. But instead of getting his change, he got handcuffs. Beaten and humiliated, he realized this wasn't about fake money. This was about power. But Malcolm wasn't just any man. When corrupt cops came after him again, they walked straight into his trap. What happens when the hunted turns into the hunter? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more gripping stories. The heat in Harrison Creek was relentless. The kind that clung to your skin, soaked into the pavement, and turned every breath into something heavy. It was the kind of day that made everything move slower. Cars creeping down the road, people lingering in the shade, even the old neon sign above the corner "Stop Gas" and Mart flickered sluggishly against the sun. Malcolm Hayes stepped onto the cracked sidewalk, the familiar creak of his boots filling the quiet space between passing cars. He had walked through war zones, through scorching deserts where the air shimmered from heat. But somehow, standing here back in his hometown, felt more foreign than any battlefield. It had been 10 years since he left, and now that he was back, Harrison Creek felt smaller. Like the town had shrunk while he had grown. The streets were the same, the people were the same, except for the way they looked at him. Malcolm had always been tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who carried his presence like armor. But there was something else now, something in his stance, the way he moved, controlled, measured. The military had refined him into a man who saw everything and missed nothing. And he saw the way people glanced at him now, like they were trying to place him but didn't quite remember. Or maybe they did and just didn't want to acknowledge it. It didn't matter. He wasn't back for them. He pulled open the door to corner stop, a small bell jingling as he stepped inside. The rush of cool air hit his skin, a sharp contrast to the heat outside. The store smelled the same dust, motor oil, and stale coffee. The place was nearly empty. A teenage boy in a gas station uniform sat behind the counter, scrolling on his phone, barely acknowledging Malcolm as he walked in. A man in a work jumpsuit grabbed a soda from the back cooler, moving with the slow exhaustion of someone who had been on their feet all day. Malcolm moved through the aisles, picking up a bottle of water and a pack of gum. Simple, routine. Just another errand on an ordinary day, but nothing in Harrison Creek stayed ordinary for long. When he approached the counter, the kid finally looked up. Josh Wheeler. He looked about 19, maybe 20, with a face that hadn't quite lost its teenage roundness. His eyes lingered on Malcolm's face, not with recognition but with something else. Something that made Malcolm's instincts tighten. He set the items down, pulled out his wallet and handed over a $20 bill. And that's when it happened. Josh hesitated, just for a second, but Malcolm caught it. The way the kid's fingers hovered over the bill, the way his eyes flicked to it, his throat bobbing as he swallowed something down. Then, almost too slowly, he picked up the bill, held it to the light, like it might suddenly reveal some hidden truth. Malcolm exhaled through his nose. "Here we go." "It's real," he said, his voice even, no edge to it. Just a statement of fact. Josh didn't respond. His fingers trembled just slightly as he moved, slipping his other hand beneath the counter. Malcolm knew the motion before it was even complete. A silent alarm. The realization settled deep in Malcolm's chest, cold beneath the heat of the day. But he didn't react, didn't move. What was there to say? Josh finally pushed his change across the counter, voice barely above a mutter. "Have a good one." Malcolm picked up the bag, turned, and stepped back outside into the blinding sun. The heat pressed down on him, thick as the tension settling in his spine. He wasn't even a full block away when he heard it. Sirens. The low whine in the distance, growing louder, sharper. He didn't turn around. Not yet. Maybe they were heading somewhere else. But then the red and blue lights flashed across the pavement, stretching long shadows ahead of him. A patrol car slowed beside him, crawling forward like a predator sizing up its prey. Then another. Malcolm stopped walking. The first car pulled ahead, blocking his path. The second one braked behind him, cutting off his exit, boxing him in. The air changed, thickened. Something unspoken settling between the gap of space between him and the officers stepping out of the car. Derek Holt and Ray Parker. Malcolm didn't know their names yet, but he knew their type. The way they carried themselves, the way they looked at him, not with curiosity but with expectation. They had already decided who he was. Holt was the taller of the two, broad-shouldered with smug confidence carved into his face. His voice was too casual, like he was playing at being friendly when everyone already knew how this was going to go. "You mind stopping right there for a second?" Malcolm didn't move, didn't argue. He had learned a long time ago that men like this didn't need much of an excuse. "What's the problem?" His voice was calm, controlled. Holt tilted his head. "Where you coming from?" Malcolm shouldn't have had to answer that, but he did. "Gas station." Holt exchanged a look with Parker. "You pay with cash." Malcolm's fingers curled slightly around the plastic bag in his grip, not in anger, not in fear, in preparation. "Yeah." Another look between the officers. A silent conversation Malcolm wasn't meant to be a part of. Holt sighed, stepping forward slightly, making himself bigger than necessary. "We got a call about a counterfeit bill." And there it was, the excuse. Malcolm didn't react, just let the words settle between them in the heat. "It wasn't counterfeit," he said evenly. Holt tilted his head, his smile thin. "Then you won't mind coming down to the station." It wasn't a question. Parker was already reaching for the cuffs. Malcolm realized then it didn't matter what he said next, because this was already happening. The shove came fast, Holt's hand slamming into Malcolm's chest. He staggered back a step, his jaw tightening, not in fear, not in submission, but in restraint. Parker grabbed his wrist, yanking his arm around, and Malcolm had a decision to make: fight back and give them the excuse they wanted, or stand there and let them drag him down like some common criminal. His pulse was steady, his muscles coiled, not to attack but to endure. Because this wasn't the fight. Not yet. And as the metal cuffs clicked around his wrists, as Holt yanked him toward the squad car with the kind of force that had nothing to do with procedure, Malcolm only had one thought. They think this is over. But it wasn't. Not by a long shot. The walls of the holding cell were the same dull, lifeless gray as the rest of the Harrison Creek Police Department, cold, unwelcoming, and built to make a man feel small. But Malcolm Hayes had sat in worse places. He had been locked in dark, foreign rooms by men who actually knew what they were doing. This was nothing. He sat on the metal bench, back straight, shoulders squared, breathing even. His wrist still throbbed from the too tight cuffs, his jaw aching slightly from the shove Holt had delivered before throwing him into the cell. Outside, he could hear the low murmur of voices, officers walking past, answering phones, the everyday business of a small-town police station that operated like a kingdom unto itself. Malcolm exhaled slowly, staring at the scuffed floor, waiting, because something was coming. It started with footsteps, not the lazy, dragging steps of a bored officer or the heavy boots of a rookie trying too hard to seem important. No, these were different, measured, purposeful, someone with authority. Malcolm didn't look up, he just listened. Then came the voice. "Get his prints, run them through." Holt. Malcolm could hear the smirk in his voice, like he still thought this was a joke. Like he still believed this would end the way it always did. The clatter of a clipboard. The clunk of the fingerprint scanner being set up. A younger officer, probably a rookie, entered the cell, avoiding Malcolm's gaze as he reached for his wrist. "You resist. I'm calling it in," he muttered, voice tight. Malcolm let out a low chuckle but didn't fight. He let the kid press his fingers into the scanner, let him do his job, let him go through the motions of what was about to be the biggest mistake of his career. The officer turned, tapping a few keys on the old station computer. A loading icon spun on the screen and then silence. A beat, then another. Malcolm didn't need to see the screen to know exactly what they were looking at. He heard the sharp intake of breath, the way the officer stiffened, the way Holt's smug demeanor faded into something else. Chief," the rookie's voice wavered. "You might want to see this." Malcolm finally looked up. Derek Holt and Ray Parker stood frozen. The smirk was gone from Holt's face, his jaw tight, his fingers twitching at his side. Parker, the quieter of the two, looked genuinely unnerved. Malcolm tilted his head, watching as Holt stepped closer, squinting at the screen like he needed the computer to lie to him. But it wouldn't, because the truth was staring them right in the face. Malcolm Hayes, former Special Forces, highly decorated war hero, top clearance, high-level operations. Honored for bravery, tactical expertise, and leadership. The kind of man who didn't just disappear quietly into a jail cell. Holt blinked, opened his mouth, closed it, then turned on his heel and stormed out of the room. Malcolm smiled to himself. Now they understood. 10 minutes later, the chief of police himself walked through the station doors. Martin Greaves had been running Harrison Creek's department for over 20 years, and he had the weight of that power on his shoulders. A tall man, lean but solid, with a face that had aged more from stress than time. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Unlock his cell," he ordered, his voice calm but carrying the kind of authority that left no room for argument. The younger officer scrambled with the keys, the bars creaking open as Malcolm stood. Greaves gestured to the side. "Step into my office, Mr. Hayes." The chief's office was tidy, organized, and smelled faintly of coffee and cigar smoke. A wall of framed commendations hung behind the desk, old photographs of the town's past mayors, police chiefs, and so-called heroes. Malcolm sat in the chair across from Greaves, watching as the older man eased into his seat, fingers steepled together, expression unreadable. "You want some coffee?" Greaves asked, voice too casual. Malcolm smirked. "I'll pass." Greaves nodded like he expected that answer. He exhaled, leaned back slightly, then folded his hands on the desk. "Look," he said, "there was a misunderstanding tonight, that's all. The cashier at the gas station overreacted, my officers jumped the gun, and now you're sitting here instead of being at home where you belong." He tilted his head slightly. "So, let's make this simple. I'll have my guys wipe the report and you can walk out of here like none of this ever happened." Malcolm didn't move, didn't blink. Then slowly he smiled. "That's a nice offer, Chief," he said, voice even. "But here's the thing. It did happen." Greaves sighed, rubbing a hand over his face like a man who had been in this position before. "I get it," he continued, his tone shifting like he was trying a different angle. "You're a man of principle. That's good. I respect that. But let's be honest, causing trouble here isn't going to fix anything. My officers were out of line. I admit that. So how about we make things right?" He opened his desk drawer, pulled out a plain white envelope and slid it across the desk. Malcolm didn't need to pick it up to know what was inside. Money. Hush money. He let the silence stretch between them, let Greaves think this might work. Then he leaned forward, picked up the envelope, felt its weight, and ripped it in half. The paper tore cleanly, the bills inside fluttering onto the desk like leaves in the wind. Greaves' jaw tightened. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes darkened. "You're making a mistake," he murmured. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, stretching slightly, letting the pain in his ribs remind him exactly why he wasn't going to let this go. "No," he said simply. "I'm making a choice." Greaves exhaled slowly, staring at him like he was calculating his next move. Then for the first time Malcolm saw it. Fear. Not fear of Malcolm himself, but fear of what he might uncover. Because Greaves knew something. Something big. Something worth protecting. And that meant Malcolm had just found the crack in the foundation. Greaves let out a slow breath, reached forward and brushed the torn bills off his desk. "You could just walk away," he said quietly. Malcolm stood, smoothing out his shirt as he met the chief's gaze. "I could," he agreed. Then with a smirk, "But I won't." And as he walked out of the office, out of the station, back into the thick night air, Malcolm knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not even close. The night air was thick with humidity as Malcolm Hayes stepped out of the Harrison Creek Police Department, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off the weight of the past few hours. The streets were quiet, but the town wasn't asleep. Not really. He could feel eyes on him, watching from behind closed blinds, from porch steps where people sat in the dark, pretending they weren't paying attention. They had seen him walk in cuffed. Now they were seeing him walk out free. That wasn't supposed to happen, but Malcolm wasn't done. Not by a long shot. 2 hours later, Malcolm sat at the worn wooden desk in his small rental apartment, the glow of his laptop screen illuminating the sharp lines of his face. The place was nothing special, just a temporary space to crash, but it served its purpose. Right now it was a war room. A half-empty bottle of whiskey sat next to his laptop, untouched. He wasn't drinking. He needed his mind clear. On the screen, rows of names and cases flickered, old police reports buried under years of neglect. He had spent the past 2 hours breaking into the system, not through brute force, but through the loopholes lazy cops left behind. Small-town police departments weren't built like military-grade security systems. They were built on bad habits, and Malcolm knew how to find them. First up, excessive force complaints. Derek Holt, 5 use-of-force complaints in the last 3 years, all dismissed. Ray Parker, 3 brutality complaints, 1 incident where a suspect was hospitalized. No charges, other officers, the same pattern. Cases that should have gone to trial. Reports that had been marked resolved with no explanation. It was systemic, not just a couple of bad cops. It was the whole damn department. Malcolm leaned back, rubbing his chin, feeling the stubble under his fingers. This wasn't just about him anymore. The next morning, the small coffee shop on Main Street was already filling up when Erica Dawson walked in, her leather satchel slung over her shoulder. She spotted Malcolm immediately, sitting in the back, his posture relaxed, but his eyes scanning every face that walked through the door. A habit. "You don't waste time, do you?" she said, sliding into the seat across from him. Malcolm smirked. "I've already wasted enough." She set her satchel down and pulled out her laptop, flipping it open. The screen reflected in her glasses as she glanced at him. "You're serious about this? You wouldn't be here if I wasn't." Erica Dawson was one of the few real journalists left in Harrison Creek, and Malcolm had done his homework on her before calling. She wasn't the kind to take bribes or back down from a fight. That's why she had spent years in this dead-end town instead of working for a big outlet, because she actually gave a damn. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, show me what you've got." Malcolm turned his laptop around and the floodgates opened. Years of dismissed cases, body cam footage that conveniently went missing, witness statements that were ignored, names of victims who had been arrested, beaten, silenced. She scrolled through the files, her expression darkening with every click. Jesus, this isn't just a few bad apples, this is a whole rotten orchard, Malcolm finished. She exhaled, rubbing a hand over her forehead. This could blow the whole department open. "If we release this, they'll come after me," Malcolm said bluntly. Erica blinked. "You know that, right? This isn't a game. These guys aren't just going to let you walk around with this information." Malcolm gave a slow nod. "They already know what I'm up to," and he was right. Across town, the police station, Chief Martin Greaves sat in his office, the morning sunlight filtering through the blinds, casting sharp lines across his desk. Derek Holt and Ray Parker stood in front of him, their expressions unreadable, their postures stiff. Greaves folded his hands together. "Hayes is a problem." Holt let out a slow breath. "Yeah, no kidding. He's got something," Greaves continued, tapping his fingers on the desk. "I don't know how deep, but it's bad. The wrong people see it, and suddenly we've got state investigators crawling up our asses." Parker shifted uneasily. "You want us to lean on him?" Greaves shook his head. "We passed that stage when he walked out of here last night. He's not just some punk we can intimidate." His gaze hardened. "We shut him down." Silence. Then Holt smirked. "You want it done quiet or loud?" Greaves exhaled through his nose. "Loud, make it look like a street fight, like he pissed off the wrong guys." "No connection to us." Parker hesitated. "You sure about this?" Holt shot him a look. "What, you got a problem now?" Parker clenched his jaw but said nothing. Greaves leaned back. "Handle it." That night, Malcolm's apartment, Malcolm knew they would come. He wasn't arrogant enough to think he was untouchable. He had seen how men like Greaves worked. If they couldn't silence you with fear, they silenced you permanently. So when he heard the faint shuffle outside his window, he didn't react. When his lights flickered, he knew it wasn't a coincidence. When the door handle jiggled, he was already moving. They were sloppy. They thought this was going to be easy. Malcolm positioned himself in the shadows, body still, breath even. Then the door burst open. Holt and Parker stepped inside, followed by two more men, faces covered, hands already reaching for weapons. Malcolm moved first. One quick step, one sharp elbow. The first man crumpled before he even had a chance to react. A second lunged. Malcolm ducked, grabbed his arm, twisted it sharply. A sickening crack filled the room. Holt swung a baton, but Malcolm was already turning, already countering, his fist colliding with Holt's ribs, knocking the air from his lungs. Parker hesitated. That was his mistake. Malcolm grabbed him by the collar and slammed him into the wall, holding him there just long enough for him to feel real fear. "Tell Greaves," Malcolm whispered, his voice low, dangerous, "that if he wants me gone, he better send better men." Parker swallowed hard, nodding. Malcolm let him go, stepping back, watching as the so-called enforcers of Harrison Creek stumbled out of his apartment, bruised, humiliated, and more importantly, scared. Malcolm exhaled, rolling his shoulders. They wanted a fight. Fine. He was just getting started. The night air in Harrison Creek was thick with humidity, the faint buzz of cicadas humming in the distance. The streets were quiet, too quiet. Malcolm Hayes felt them before he saw them. It wasn't the first time he'd been followed. He had spent years tracking men in war zones, moving through enemy territory where a single mistake meant death. If Holt, Parker, and their goons thought they were sneaky, they had no idea what they were up against. Malcolm didn't look over his shoulder. Looking meant you were afraid. Looking meant you weren't in control. Instead, he walked with the same even, steady stride he always had, hands relaxed, shoulders loose, like a man who had no idea his life was about to be in danger. Except he wasn't in danger. They were. 2 days earlier, Malcolm had chosen the perfect battleground. It was an alley behind Sutter's Hardware, a narrow space wedged between two buildings. Cramped, enclosed, and full of blind spots, the kind of place where corrupt cops could drag someone for a beating without witnesses. Or so they thought. But Malcolm had prepared. 3 hidden cameras, one on the fire escape, another tucked into a drainpipe, and the last inside an old, abandoned phone booth at the alley's entrance. A vantage point from nearby apartments. He had spoken to some of the residents, people tired of the cops running the town unchecked. They had promised to keep their phones ready. If Holt and Parker came after him, this was where he would end it. Malcolm turned into the alley, his steps slow, deliberate. He heard the low shuffle of boots on pavement, the soft creak of leather as a hand tensed into a fist, the controlled breathing of men ready for violence. They were right behind him. He stopped, didn't turn, didn't speak, just waited, and then, "You should have kept your mouth shut, Hayes." The voice was familiar. Holt. Malcolm finally turned around. The streetlights barely reached into the alley, casting only faint, flickering shadows. Holt stood at the front, his smirk as smug as ever, while Parker hovered at his side, looking more nervous than usual. Behind them, two masked men clearly hired muscle. "Surprised you had the guts to face me yourself," Malcolm said, his voice calm, controlled. Holt chuckled, rolling his shoulders. "It ain't about guts, Hayes. It's about finishing what we started." Malcolm tilted his head, playing along. "What, the part where you arrested me for a crime I didn't commit? The part where you beat me in the street? Or the part where you tried to kill me in my own home?" Parker flinched at that last part, his fingers twitching at his sides. He knew Malcolm wasn't bluffing. Holt, on the other hand, just sneered. "I don't care what you think you know. What matters is that when this night is over, you're done. You step out of line in this town, you get dealt with. Always been that way, always will be." Malcolm exhaled slowly. "You talk too much." Holt's smirk twitched. "Shut him up," he growled. And then the first punch came. Malcolm let the punch land. It wasn't a clean hit. Holt was a brawler, not a trained fighter, but it was enough to split Malcolm's lip and snap his head to the side. More importantly, it was enough to make sure every camera caught it. Holt stepped back, grinning, waiting for Malcolm to collapse. He didn't. Instead, Malcolm lifted his head, wiped his bleeding lip with the back of his hand, and smiled. "My turn." He moved fast. Holt didn't even see it coming. Malcolm's fist slammed into Holt's ribs, sending him stumbling back. Parker lunged, but Malcolm twisted, grabbed his arm, and drove a sharp elbow into his jaw, knocking him to the ground. One of the masked men swung at him, but Malcolm ducked low, using his military training to sweep the guy's legs out from under him. The second attacker tried to charge, but Malcolm sidestepped, pivoted, and slammed a brutal knee into his stomach, dropping him like a sack of bricks. In less than 10 seconds, it was over. Holt was on his knees, coughing, holding his ribs. Parker lay against the alley wall, stunned. The two masked men were groaning on the pavement, completely useless, and Malcolm, still standing. Malcolm heard it before he saw it, footsteps approaching, doors creaking open, the soft hum of a phone recording. People had heard the fight. Now they were watching. The alley entrance wasn't empty anymore. A woman in a bathrobe stood on her front steps, phone raised, camera flashing. A group of teenagers from the apartment building across the alley were recording everything, their screens glowing in the dark. A man leaned against his truck at the curb, arms crossed, watching silently. The people of Harrison Creek weren't looking away this time, and the best part, Malcolm's hidden cameras had caught every second of what just happened. Holt scrambled to his feet, panic setting in. "Get up!" he snapped at Parker, but Parker was too dazed to move. The crowd at the alley entrance grew, more people stepping out of their homes, their businesses, their parked cars. The whispers started, "Ain't that Officer Holt? Holy shit, they tried to jump him. You getting this on camera? Oh yeah, this is going online right now." Holt knew. He had lost. He staggered back, spitting blood onto the pavement, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. Malcolm took a slow step forward. "Go ahead, Holt. Arrest me. Charge me with something. Try and explain this." Holt's hands curled into fists, but there was nothing left for him to do. The truth was out. They had walked into a trap, and everyone had seen it. Red and blue lights flashed in the distance. Sirens. Someone had called the cops, the real ones. Parker, still gasping on the ground, looked up at Holt. "What do we do?" Holt was breathing hard, his chest rising and falling with anger, but even he wasn't stupid enough to resist now. Malcolm gave them a small, satisfied nod. "You run this town, huh?" he murmured. "Not anymore." Holt turned and fled into the night. Parker followed, dragging himself to his feet, disappearing around the corner. Malcolm didn't chase them. He didn't have to. Because when the police cars pulled up, when the footage started hitting social media, it was already too late for them. The storm had been coming for a long time. Malcolm Hayes stood in his small apartment watching the news roll in. The video had gone viral, not just in Harrison Creek, not just in the state, everywhere. It had started as a ripple, a few local reporters picking up the footage from social media. But then bigger outlets got their hands on it. National news stations dissected it frame by frame. Analysts called it one of the worst cases of small-town police corruption exposed in recent history. And just like that, Harrison Creek Police Department was on fire. Malcolm and Erica Dawson, the investigative journalist he had partnered with, wasted no time. With the town's eyes on them, they released everything. Records of suppressed complaints, reports of excessive force conveniently dismissed, cases of victims who had been silenced, bullied, or disappeared. The town couldn't ignore it anymore, and then the victims started coming forward. First, it was a young man who had been beaten and left on the side of the road by Holt and Parker years ago. His case had been swept under the rug. Then a woman spoke up. Her husband had been arrested under false charges because he tried to file a complaint against the police. Then another, and another. Each story built upon the last, a tidal wave of voices that the department could no longer drown out. And just like that, the trial was inevitable. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled. Reporters lined the back wall. The entire town was watching. Malcolm sat at the witness stand, his posture steady, his voice calm. He had faced war criminals in international trials before. This wasn't any different. The prosecution didn't waste time. They played the videos for the jury. The footage of Malcolm being beaten in the alley. The evidence of corruption buried in police records. The confession, caught on camera, of Holt and Parker trying to cover up their crimes. Every time a new piece of evidence flashed across the screen, Malcolm saw the defendants sink deeper into their seats. Ray Parker looked pale, his hands clenched in his lap. Derek Holt's jaw twitched, his usual arrogance gone. Martin Greaves, the police chief, sat stiffly, his face unreadable, but Malcolm knew. He knew the man felt the walls closing in. Then came the final testimony. Malcolm looked directly at the jury. "Harrison Creek was never about justice," he said, his voice even, unshaken. "It was about power, about who had it and who didn't, but that ends today." A heavy silence followed. Then the judge spoke. "Let's proceed with the sentencing." The judge didn't hold back. Ray Parker, 12 years in federal prison for covering up crimes, falsifying police reports, and enabling brutality. Derek Holt, 25 years in federal prison for brutality, abuse of power, and assault. Martin Greaves, 40 years in federal prison for orchestrating a corrupt system, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. As the sentences were read aloud, a murmur spread through the courtroom. Some gasped, others whispered. A few people nodded in quiet satisfaction, and Malcolm, he simply exhaled, not out of relief, but because it was done. The Harrison Creek Police Department was dismantled. The Department of Justice took over, sending in federal investigators to clean house. For the first time in decades, Harrison Creek wasn't ruled by fear. It was changing. The sun was high, beating down on the pavement as Malcolm stepped up to the gas station. It looked exactly the same as before. But this time, everything was different. He pushed open the door. The soft jingle of the bell greeted him, the cool blast of air conditioning washing over his skin. Malcolm paused at the counter, glancing at the new cashier, not Josh Wheeler. The young man who had called the cops on him for no reason had been fired. The new cashier, a woman in her 40s, glanced up and gave a polite nod. No hesitation, no suspicion. "Afternoon," she said. "What can I get you?" Malcolm grabbed a bottle of water, placing it on the counter. "That'll be $1.50, she said, ringing it up. He pulled out a $20 bill and handed it over. This time, no one questioned it. No alarms, no cops, no threats. The woman handed him his change. "Have a good one." Malcolm picked up the bottle, turned, and walked out.